Good. So we're oh, there you go. Welcome. We will say welcome for anyone who's watching the video. It's good to have you here. So we're now into Matthew 21. So we're now technically moving into, which is quite a good timing. I didn't really plan it this way, but we're moving into Jesus's final days. Just over a week now as we start. Obviously for the crucifixion and resurrection. Obviously not final days. Don't want you to write me off as a heretic there. But we're moving into passages which are kind of familiar during this Easter period, which we're just coming into. So we're into Lent now. We're running down towards Easter, and we are beginning to look at those kind of passages. Say that was all good planning. So we're into Matthew 21. I've called it Peace, Power and Donkeys. Because obviously this is we sometimes refer to it as the triumphal entry kind of passage. So we're starting in Matthew 21. So now they approached Jerusalem and arrived at Bethphage near the Mount of Olives. So there's a slight kind of abbreviation to the way that Matthew's doing it. We've been up in Jericho. We've left. There's been a few days around Jericho as we've put the Gospels together. But as we've left Jericho, there's been the healing of the blind men, which we looked at last week. And so now Matthew kind of goes straight into them approaching Jerusalem and arriving at Bethphage. Now, when we mix the kind of the Gospels together, we kind of find Jesus arriving in Bethany 6 days before Passover, and then the next day they're going to Bethphage. But I suspect the route is the route in, even if they kind of arrive in Bethany on is where they finally go to. If you look at the maps, Bethphage is kind of closer. It's actually on the run up to on the western side of the Mount of Olives, just running out there. Bethany is a little bit further out to the west. But actually, I suspect the pilgrim route kind of would approach Jerusalem, and they're probably bending off around to kind of settle themselves. They go a little bit further into Bethany because Jesus establishes himself there with the family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, of course. And although they won't be there every single night, that seems to be their base. But they would actually probably pass through Bethphage on the way to Bethany, therefore. But then again, or alternative, we start the next day. They come through Bethphage on their way from Bethany to Jerusalem. All very boring technical detail, but it all fits. So they're there, and Jesus actually sends two of them ahead. So he says, "Go into the village that's ahead of you, and you'll find a donkey tied and a colt with her. So untie them and bring them to me. But if anyone says anything to you, you'll explain the Lord needs them, and quickly he will send them." And, I can always remember kind of growing up, obviously having a Christian family and going to Bible teaching things at church. But equally going to a Church of England school. And so I've always been aware that, there's always that question. And in one sense, it's unanswerable. Is this divine knowledge, or is it something that Jesus has planned? I tend to err towards the side that this is very much the feel of operation in words of knowledge. As Jesus sets out, he kind of had, I suspect, therefore, he has that kind of growing sense in himself of the importance of Jerusalem, and something in him is prompted that actually there's something about the donkey. And actually the Lord will have put this together because, as we're going to see, there is a large amount of prophetic content to the event that Jesus is going to enact out for us. So some of that content he would have grown up meditating on, praying about, recognizing himself within that context. And so it seems he briefs a couple of the disciples, we don't know which, to go on ahead. And whether it's been prearranged, that's always a debate with somebody that he knows is going to be there. He's already planned for it to get there. We don't get much of that sense. It's always possible, but it feels much more to me like a description of that sort of prophetic instinct that's based both on the knowledge he has from Scripture that's already tied down, and the sort of that moment in the Holy Spirit. And so he asks the disciples to go and do the things he does. And Matthew gets straight into the fact, you see, that then, but this all of this happened so that what was spoken by the prophet could be fulfilled. So it's like Matthew is kind of saying, so Jesus is aware of that prophetic content, and actually as he's thinking, okay, if that's what the prophecy says, that's what it talks about, then the Lord is going to provide the donkey for my final arrival in Jerusalem. So how's that going to happen? I'm going to act in faith on the words that have been written, but with that kind of so that's, if you like, the logos word, the written word, with that rhema word, that inspirational word that says to me there's something here to go and arrange. And so Matthew quotes and gives us some context. So tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king comes to you, humble and riding on a donkey, the colt, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so Jesus has already kind of flagged that when you go, you will find a donkey and a colt with her. Now, the prophecy itself could just be a colt, because a colt is a donkey. It's just a young donkey. But somehow Jesus has kind of apprehended in the spirit correctly that a colt it's a lot of pressure to ride the whole day on a young colt who's not been broken in for riding. It's very stressful for the animal as well. But actually, we often talk about the fact that when a colt is being broken in, the person riding on it, the mother will be there. But I suspect there's more. This is, again, it's just personal thinking about meditating on the verses. Because actually, as we put the story together, for instance, with some of the conversations that seem to go on during the day, the day starts in the morning, and Jesus doesn't arrive in Jerusalem until quite late. We don't get that from Matthew's gospel because he kind of blends straight into the clearing of the temple. It all sounds like it happens on one day. But Mark's gospel highlights that when Jesus finally gets to Jerusalem, it's late in the evening or early evening. He goes into the temple, looks around, and then returns and comes back in the next day, this time not riding on a donkey, and we have the clearing of the money changers. And that whole incident is a totally separate prophetic incident, which we'll look at next week. This is a very kind of contained prophetic incident, but as I'm drawing out the story, if Jesus is kind of travelling in, and it's a slow process, and he's engaging and connecting with the crowd, as we read about it in John's Gospel, with various people coming to talk to him, and so that there's not just it's not just a kind of a spontaneous and quick laying down of coats and palm leaves and so on. Actually, there's quite a lot of interaction that goes on. Because what we've got to remember is that Passover is getting close, and there are continuous crowds on the roads. They're not all particularly following Jesus. They're on the roads because they're heading into Jerusalem. There are those who are his entourage who are heading into Jerusalem with him, but they themselves are in a bigger crowd of people who are just coming up for the feasts. So as I say, it wouldn't surprise me at all if there are moments when Jesus is riding the mother donkey and other times he's riding the colt, just separating some of the burden during the day and so on. But actually, the quote from Zechariah 9 is kind of an interesting one to stop and kind of take a little bit of time on, because we tend to, as is often the way, we learn bits of the Bible that are significant, kind of isolated from their context. And so we often have a slightly biased view of what they're saying, because we're hearing this verse quoted in the flow of Matthew. And we go back and look in Zechariah, we actually find it's the summation of a passage which is actually covered and prophesied. So Zechariah he appears towards the end of the Old Testament history, and he prophesies things that are fulfilled by Alexander the Great. And then in contrast, as you get to verse 9 of Zechariah 9, he creates a contrast, as we will see, with a king who comes in peace, whereas, of course, Alexander the Great was a great conqueror. So if you go to Zechariah 9, I've highlighted here, So rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He's righteous, having salvation, lowly and riding on the donkey, even the colt, the foal of a donkey. So you've got both of them there, a donkey and the colt as well, the foal of the donkey. But I've highlighted some words in yellow, so you can see them. It's just interesting. Zechariah 9, verse 9, is actually 22 words long. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and Jesus' name is actually spelt out every 22nd letter as you read through this particular prophecy. So it's just another of these key kind of prophecies that relate to Jesus, where you can find Jesus' name spelt out by skipping forwards a number of letters. And the yellow words are the words that they appear in. So rejoice, Jerusalem, salvation, and colt, which are kind of really sum up, though they're the summation of what the verse is all about. Here is Jesus coming into Jerusalem. The crowds are going to rejoice. Jesus' name itself means salvation, although the form of the word salvation here is slightly broader. And there's the colt, of course, is a significant player in the story. So that it's a really significant verse, which is why Matthew has so clearly placed it there. But if we put it into context of Zechariah 9, Zechariah 9 starts verses 1 to 4 talking about other places, Hamath, Tyre and Sidon, which are all key cities up in Lebanon, up in the kind of the northern coastal area. And in actual fact, they very accurately prophesy what eventually Alexander is going to do. So after Alexander comes, and after a 7-month siege, he destroys the. This is now of Tyre. He takes Tyre by besieging it for 7 months, and eventually he uses the rubble to build a causeway to the island part and so on. And it's very accurately follows the prediction in Zechariah about their wealth being cast into the sea and so on and so forth. See, Yahweh will dispose of her and cast her wealth into the sea. That's Zechariah 9 verse 4. So Alexander actually does do this physically as a part of history a few hundred years later. So here you go. This is up kind of more level with Damascus, Tyre and Sidon. You can see Hamath is even further north. So we're talking about as Alexander comes conquering down the coast. He's gone through Hamath and Sidon, and then he gets to Tyre, throws its wealth into the sea. Then we go on in Zechariah to verses 5 to 8, which talks about Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod, which are all key Philistine cities. So he continues down the coast, comes into Philistia. And they, what actually happens to them is he conquers them, but then eventually the people who lived there get absorbed into being part of Judah. So they actually, by marriage, they end up becoming Jewish. And so, as was prophesied by Zechariah, so a mixed race will dwell in Ashdod, and there will be a remnant for our God, and Ekron, like a Jebusite. So it's referring back to in the early days when David... they'd first taken Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and the Jebusites became kind of absorbed into the Judahites by marriage, you see. So a similar thing is happening here. So again, in this verse in Zechariah, which seems very, very significant in terms of its prophecy of Jesus for umpteen different reasons, as we touched on, even in Jesus' name kind of woven into the text, but actually is following events that happen in a very short period under the leadership, well, I say a short period, over a couple of year period, because it takes them a while to destroy all the cities. But as Alexander campaigns down the coast from the north to the south, and then we read about how he then has his attention turned in towards Jerusalem, which is a rebellious city. It's got that kind of reputation as being somewhere that's always holding out. And he's intending to head in to destroy Jerusalem. Oh, here you go. Here's the little map. So Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath, which you can see kind of in by the time of Jesus, they're right there next to Judah. They've been kind of absorbed as a people into it. So Alexander doesn't actually conquer Jerusalem, although he sets out that way. So Josephus explains a bit of the story, we get an alternative version of the story in the Talmud, which agrees in a lot and disagrees in certain details. That's the nature of these things. I decided, seeing as we're not doing a kind of a deeper pass, I'm just going to show you the Josephus verses rather than confuse it with the Talmud's account. So in Antiquities, book 11, Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, so here we go, as talked about in the prophecies in Zechariah, made haste to go to Jerusalem. And Jaddua the high priest, that's one of the differences in the Talmud, it's someone called Simon the high priest. But, those kind of things, sometimes people are using multiple names. We can't kind of fully unravel those things. He was under terror as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians. So he's obviously in a nervous position. So he ordained that the people should make supplications, so they pray about it, and should join with him in offering sacrifices to God, who he prayed to protect the nation and deliver from the perils that were coming upon them. So then God warned him in a dream. So ... You kind of keep on reading. There's a whole lot of stuff, and I'm not going to put it all up. But you get to a point. So God kind of basically warns him, and he says you should go out and meet him with celebration, not to kind of in confrontation, but go and meet him in celebration. It seems that God also appears to Alexander that night. So he goes out and they take him into the temple. And at one point in that process, as we go on, he shows him the book of Daniel. You see. So then the book of Daniel was showed to him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians. So you probably will remember the 4 empires and the very kind of clear parallels with the ministry of, or with the reign of Alexander, and then eventually the division of his empire. But it talks about the goat as a great leader who comes and conquers the world, and he's a Greek. He's from sorry, I won't say what things I'm not totally clear on, because they'll be recorded for eternity, me getting things wrong if I do. So Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, and he, i.e. Alexander, supposed that he was that person. And as he went, he was glad, and he dismissed the multitude, and he doesn't destroy the temple. And we're told in the Talmud version that he then intends at some point to set up his image in the temple, but they explain that they can't do that because God doesn't allow them to have their images or other gods there. But he still doesn't destroy the temple, and as a result, they say in the Talmuds that the name Alexander gets adopted as a Jewish name, and that is a historical fact. That we know in ancient legal documents that when Jews who had non-Jewish names had their names written into legal documents, for instance, like a marriage certificate or divorce certificate, they were indicated as the fact that their name was not Jewish. But actually, when you find the name Alexander, it's actually written as a Jewish name. So there is a whole history, and that's even recognised and debated today, about the fact that Alexander gets adopted as a fully Jewish name. And the Talmuds actually tie this kind of incident that's referred to in Josephus, which is probably the fulfilment of the prophecies in Zechariah, as to how the name of Alexander becomes such an obvious Jewish name. Even the surname Sander could possibly be a kind of which is a common Jewish name, although sometimes people think it's related to a German word. But it's possible as well that part of that is to do with this incident. So it's an incident with a lot of precedent, and yet it's also controversial. And of course, the reason it's controversial is because of the way it ties in so much with the biblical events and the story of Jesus. So here, Josephus is referring to the book of Daniel. And he assumes that the book of Daniel was around when Alexander was around. But that doesn't fit modern theory, because Daniel's prophecies are all so accurate that modern theory wants to make Daniel kind of written just a few years before Jesus came along. Well, they had to abandon that position when the Qumran caves were uncovered, because there are 6 copies of the book of Daniel dating back to around 200 and earlier BC. So modern scholarship now has to accept that Daniel has been around since before 200 BC, but it still doesn't want to push it back to the 300s or the 4th century when Alexander was conquering these locations, and where Josephus is telling us the story about how the book of Daniel was shown to him. So you can understand, therefore, why all of these things are controversial. So a lot of modern scholars reject this story because it comes from Josephus, even though it's kind of paralleled also in the Talmuds, which would normally make it a dead cert, but they do so on the basis that that Josephus refers to the book of Daniel, because they will not believe that Daniel could have existed at that point because of his accurate prophecies. Now, how did we get to Daniel? Because we've been talking about Zechariah, because Zechariah is the bit that was quoted. But actually, at the time that Zechariah's prophecy is being fulfilled, Alexander is already recognizing himself in the previous prophecies of the emperor from Greece who's conquering the world that we get from the book of Daniel. So you see how all these different bits tie together, and they all focus in, because the contrast. So we're coming back to Matthew now. Let's go back to when I last kind of produced had the verses. Here we go. Here's the verses. So by the time we get to Zechariah 9, which is quoted by Matthew, when in the event, the incident that's recorded in the Talmuds and in Josephus, Alexander approaches Jerusalem riding on a war horse, and that is kind of a contrast is then highlighted in Zechariah. Do we have it here? But you need to rejoice, because actually someone like Alexander, but is coming, but now in peace, not riding a war horse, because they're riding a donkey and a colt, which is what you do when you come in peace, when an emperor comes in peace or a king comes in peace. So the verse itself in Zechariah 9 is not a prophecy of Alexander, because Alexander comes in military regalia towards the city, and that's why they're fearful of him. He comes in those ways, but there's something of the kind of, if you like, the empire. There's an empire dynamic to the person who's coming, but he's coming in peace as he rides into Jerusalem. And so, as is often the way with Old Testament prophecies, there's a kind of a blend from earthly events into something with a more heavenly spiritual dynamic, which is what's going on here. So when you put all of the pieces together, for those with understanding, by which I don't mean to say you have to be super brainy, you just need to have been versed in and talked about and educated in all of these sort of bits of prophecies, which actually the Jewish communities were. When you read what the Talmuds are, they are kind of they are records of people discussing their Old Testament scripture. So a lot of these ideas you see then percolate into people. It creates a great expectation, because you would be aware of the fact that while a lot of Zechariah 9 has been fulfilled in Alexander the Great, who actually was always very favourable to the Jewish people, and actually we therefore we adopted his name as a fully Jewish name, and the second largest city in the Roman Empire is still the city of Alexandria, which was founded by Alexandria with the help of a large Jewish legion, or it wouldn't be called a legion back in those days, would it? A large Jewish army, you see. So we were aware of all of that, but there's something different here, because here we're looking at our king coming to Jerusalem, riding not like in war, like Zechariah did. Sorry, like Alexander did, but coming in peace, riding on a donkey. So that's hopefully that all kind of makes sense. So as a result, of course, as they come in, so the disciples went and they did exactly as Jesus instructed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and they put their coats on them, and he sat on them. Now, I touched on that in my mind, because there is actually a whole day that is then taken of Jesus moving through the pilgrim crowds who are beginning to camp. All those who are coming from the western side of Jerusalem are all going. Sorry, not on the eastern side of Jerusalem, not the western side. I always get my directions the wrong way around. Are coming from the east. They all tend to camp on the eastern side, and of course that's the. It's also, if you're coming from the north or south, better to go on the eastern side because you have quicker access into the temple. And they tend to camp up the Mount of Olives in the whole region all around. And as Jesus has come now into that region where there are already pilgrims beginning to camp and get ready for Passover, he slowly works his way, riding perhaps sometimes on the colt, sometimes on the mother donkey, right the way through them. There are conversations that go on all day. There are people starting to put these things together. No doubt somebody quotes the verse early on and it starts to ripple around the crowd. So the huge multitude, so the reference to that huge multitude is not a huge multitude that have all come with Jesus. He has a crowd with him. We've read about that already, but it's this huge multitude that are beginning to gather for the Passover. So as he's working his way through them and the words are buzzing out, it's likely, if we're putting the stories together, that Lazarus is with him, and we read that some people were fascinated because Lazarus was there, and this is a famous story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Matthew doesn't tell us about that. He just flags the fact, and just the verse itself should be exciting enough. The cutting down of branches is something that the pilgrims will tend to do anyway, because palm branches make good kind of shade during the day. So if you're camping on the hillsides and you're caught out in the middle of the day, you want to have something to be shaded with. But as they're cutting those branches down, they then use them to spread them out and kind of make a way through for Jesus. And so they start moving on ahead, and the word of what Jesus is doing starts to ripple through. And so they're all shouting, "Hosanna, the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And as I say, you can. Matthew's kind of. He gives us a huge number of events, but he tends to tell them in quite abbreviated form. But you can kind of get that sense of how the knowledge ripples through, particularly based around this prophecy, which is such a significant one, that it's already there in the Talmud's discussion about it, because of the discussion around the things that happened with Alexander, who was such a key person within Jewish culture, and so on and so forth, and suddenly that slightly nuanced thing of our king, not their king, who's not coming in war but coming in peace, and he's entering Jerusalem on the donkey and the colt. And so they were all there travelling with Jesus. Now, when Jesus then entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, asking, "Who is this?" So the word has got on ahead, and the question of who is this is coming. And so the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." And that's the point I've chosen today. So keeping an eye on the time, to kind of to kind of stop the verses we're looking at, because as I say, Matthew kind of jumps in to telling us the story of then the clearing of the temple. Actually, does he go straight into the clearing of the temple? I think he kind of does a wind back as well. There's a little bit where he winds back and tells us how Jesus has cursed the fig tree as well. But he we're going to get into another very important prophetic event, which, very similar to this riding in, pulls in various verses, not just one or two, but several different verses that all are acted out within the context of what Jesus starts to do and how he behaves in the final week of his earthly life and ministry. So really what I wanted to just kind of get across was there's something kind of empire-like, there is an ascension coming for Jesus. His approach to Jerusalem, which was prophesied by Zechariah, who saw in it the kind of the empire building of a future coming king, the Greek king, who conquers all of these cities, and these things happen to them, which have actually happened. and were written well before Alexander came, and you can't get rid of those so easily as you can with Daniel. that Daniel, who'd prophesied that about that king as well, but the character in Zechariah 9 verse 9 is not that king, because he comes in peace, not on a war horse like Alexander had. That's the contrast. But it makes you stop and think about the character. Famously, of course, a lot of the early, not the early church, a lot of medieval style Christianity believes Jesus dies at exactly the age of 33 because of the assumption of him sort of paralleling almost as the Christ, and Alexander being a kind of an earthly human equivalent. Because Alexander dies at the age of 33, they assume Jesus dies at the age of 33, which you can get to, because Luke says he was about 33 when he started his ministry. But actually, I think that starting point is actually much earlier than most people. People then assume that means when he first starts to itinerate around Galilee, although Luke says it at an earlier point. And they assume that he means exactly 33, and that Jesus' ministry lasted exactly 3 years. Almost all of those assumptions, I think, are not strong ones that you can kind of really lean on. You can believe it if you want to, but Jesus' ministry from the time he starts to itinerate together with the team is more like 3.5 years, or perhaps even slightly longer. And he's already been a rabbi, recognized as a senior rabbi for about 9 months before that. And seeing as the marker is when he begins to teach, you can kind of take that back even further. So I don't think that that Jesus dies at the age of 33, but I think that part of the thing is there's something in the success of Alexander at a human level that is somehow supposed to be superseded, and in a kinder and more generous and more peaceful way by the king that Zechariah anticipates. And so that is worth, if you like, taking a whole day to establish by his actions amongst the crowd. So that's probably all I wanted to kind of particularly push in and say at this stage. But would anyone like to ask any questions? And we'll say next week we will do the bit that often people instantly blend in. I think Matthew, by not making it clear that there's 2 days between the events, Matthew does create a very kind of powerful pace to the telling of Jesus's last week. But most Christians, most people in church, if you ask them, would probably imagine that the clearing of the temple happens on the same day as Jesus rides in on the donkey. And Matthew doesn't give us anything that would disavow that. We get that from Mark's gospel, but we'll look at that a little bit more detail next time. So anyway, yeah, I can keep going on those things for ages. Would anyone like to ask anything or observe anything, or contribute anything?
I just wondered if you could explain